Good afternoon and welcome to this PLAS webinar. My name is Ruth Hall. I am at the Institute for Poverty, Land and Agrarian Studies, PLAS, at the University of the Western Cape, South Africa. I'm very glad to welcome you all to this webinar. We have just 1 hour to tackle a massive topic, women's land rights in Africa. We're focusing today on the realities of legal pluralism and the failure to implement all the rights frameworks that exist both within the African continent and globally, a chronic problem that is faced by many of our countries. Today is one of our special webinars that we hold once a month as PLAS. It forms part of our partnership with the Network of Excellence on Land Governance in Africa. It's a network whose name is shortened to NELGA. NELGA is based at the African Land Policy Center in Addis Ababa and is connected with the African Union, UN Economic Commission for Africa, and the African Development Bank. As part of NELGA, PLAS puts on a short course on the political economy of land governance in Africa. And we have conducted this training in various regions in partnership with universities in West and East and Southern Africa, and trained people from about 16 countries. Today, we're going to be talking about women's land rights. Now, during the COVID-19 crisis, we've seen people's lives disrupted, but we know that one thing that is not on lockdown is evictions. And we know that women particularly are vulnerable to losing their access to land at the hands of male relatives, of companies, of traditional authorities, of governments. And insecure land rights continues to shape patterns of economic exclusion and marginalization. And we know that this is often a gendered dynamic. So today we're going to be looking at the broad question of how African states have been engaging with this process. We are going to be talking to activists and a researcher. So 25 years ago, we had the Beijing Conference, a key moment in establishing international norms around women's land rights. 4 years ago, women from across the African continent converged in a mass civil society mobilization in Tanzania. It was called the Kilimanjaro Initiative, to try to put the issue of women's land rights at the top of government's agendas, literally by taking this message to the top of Africa. And African governments have listened, have adopted protocols. We have a framework and guidelines on land policy in Africa from the African Union. We have the global voluntary guidelines on the governance of tenure that were agreed through the FAO. We have, through the African Union, a set of guiding principles on large-scale land-based initiatives which emphasize women's rights to land. So civil society groups around Africa have put a lot of time and effort into engaging around trying to establish these rights frameworks. And we're going to be talking today to 3 people who over the past few years have played a key role in trying to take these frameworks and to check what is actually happening in practice and how can we turn these rights on paper into rights in reality. So we're going to be discussing what the research has found and what activities and forms of activism have been taken up to address this. The project is one that was anchored in the Oxfam Pan-Africa program based in Nairobi and was implemented in 7 countries in Africa: Cameroon, Ethiopia, Malawi, Kenya, Mozambique, South Africa, and Togo. So with that, we want to use this opportunity today to learn from these initiatives and to chart out the next phase of research and activism around realizing women's rights. I'm very pleased today to introduce my colleague, Emmanuel Sule, from Tanzania, who is a research associate at PLAS and also completing his PhD. He is a well-known leading scholar on land governance issues. He's got over 15 years of experience working on topics ranging from land tenure, natural resource governance, rural livelihoods, and inclusive business models. He's been a researcher at UWC for several years, focusing on land rights, agricultural commercialization, and land grabbing. Emmanuel, let's start with you. This research started 3 years ago. Part of the work initially was to develop a checklist, looking at all of these rights frameworks, global charters, African charters, voluntary guidelines, guiding principles, all the protocols that governments have signed up to, and to establish a checklist to say what should all of our governments be doing, what should be the laws in our constitutions, what should be the laws, what should be the policies and institutional practices. And then you conducted a baseline. Can you tell us then, what is it that you were looking for? What did you set out to find? How was the research conducted, and what were your findings?
Thank you very much, Ruth. It's a pleasure to talk on women's land rights. There's no doubt that women's land rights is one of the top agenda in our policymaking process and in our research areas. We understand that today women's land rights is critical because women are facing double onslaught in their land rights due to increasing pressures from large-scale land-based investment in extractive sectors, agriculture, and forestry. So following successful initiatives at the African Union level and at the global level, Oxfam and PLUS, we decided to do a study. And our study particularly wanted to bring new nuances on what we already know on implementation of policies and land laws in African countries. So we specifically sought to understand how far are our African countries implementing resolutions that are made at the global and the continental level. So we selected 4 existing tools, that is African Framework and Guidelines on Policy on Land, that was adopted in 2007, and VGTT, as Ruth highlighted now. We were very specific. We wanted to develop a tool that rural women can use and speak for themselves instead of having academic research that are frozen in shelves. So we developed Women's Land Rights Scorecard that is a quantifiable tool to measure and monitor the performance of selected African countries on how they're implementing the provisions of selected instruments that provide for women's land rights. And we look on 5 themes, and across such themes, we asked 5 questions. And we are very keen on this because we want women themselves to do not only the advocacy, but also monitoring of how government are doing in terms of implementing such tools that they have signed to themselves. So we are asking, are provisions made in the law to guarantee women's equal access to land? Are women's legislated land rights protected and enforced in practice? We are looking at whether women are able to assert their control over the land they use. We are also looking at whether women are able to make meaningful contribution in the governance of land. We wanted to know in African countries whether women's land rights are protected when it comes to large-scale land-based investment in key sectors like extractive sectors, agriculture, tourism, and forestry, where large-scale land-based are allocated. So we developed a simple tool that can be used by rural women, even those who cannot read and cannot write. As I will show very quickly in my quick slides, you will see that the tools that we have developed are able to allow communities at the grassroots level to check on their governments, to check on their grassroots organizations, to check with their traditional authorities, because they have simple tools that they can use. On those questions, we are highlighting tools that are capable to capture what's happening in terms of the provisions of the laws, in land laws, in constitutions, in policies, and we are looking into tools that communities can use. And then within each country, we are asking if the country is focusing on protecting women's land rights. When the countries are protecting women's land rights, then women are happy, and you can see their green and their smiling face. If countries are not really protecting, but their provisions in laws, but in practice there is nothing, then we see women are partially smiling. But definitely, if there is no provisions, or if there's a slight provisions, but there is no implementation on ground, then women are not happy at all. Their faces will depict a no sign. And we went into 7 African countries. We researched in Cameroon, we researched in Ethiopia, we researched in Kenya, we researched in Malawi. In all these countries, we not only looked at whether they're implementing the African voluntary guidelines and the frameworks or the VGTT, but we also looked into their constitutions, we look into their land policies, their land laws. And what we are finding is countries, all of them, 7 of them that we studied, that I will mention some of them, South Africa, Mozambique, Togo, they have provisions that provide for equal women and men's land rights in their constitutions, in their land laws, and some that have policies also provide for equal land right. But the problem is implementation. As you can see in those 5 questions that I raised, the first theme, which asks whether there are provisions in the law to guarantee women land rights. If you look at Ethiopia, first theme is slightly green because there are provisions. In Kenya too, they are very, very good in the terms of provision, and indefinitely even the new constitution of Kenya is the most comprehensive in terms of provisions made for men and women's land rights. In Cameroon, slightly not good in terms of provisions in law. If you go into countries like Mozambique, then situation is not very good. If you go to South Africa, provisions are very good. So in some ways, what we are seeing is that countries are at different levels in terms of implementing not only the laws that they have made themselves, but also into signing and abiding to international and continental resolutions. Therefore, in countries where democracies are at high levels, like in South Africa, in different provinces, we are witnessing women publicly protesting and demanding their rights to land, and they also demand that they need to provide prior informed consent in such large-scale investment, even mining. Therefore, if you look overall, our findings are a bit worse, because what we are finding is that countries are not performing in terms of addressing and implementing provisions that provide for equal women's land rights overall. So the overall African picture, based on the 7 countries that we have studied, you can see in the picture, is on the map of Africa, is really red, which is the worst performance in several ways, because the provisions are there, they are not understood at the local level, and therefore women themselves cannot assert their powers to really demand that the governments implement what they want to have, such equal access and use of land and other resources attached to it. So what are we understanding from here? We're also finding that in Africa, there's a lot of lack of awareness on land rights. And this is because women among men have less access to formal education. Therefore, they have less access to information about their land rights. We are also witnessing that there's a lot of legal pluralism. We have not only statutory laws, but we also have customary laws that contradict often the provisions in the formal laws. I think I will end here, and thank you, Ruth, for this opportunity.
Thanks, Sule. I mean, it's a shocking picture, really, and it depicts what we already know, which is that governments are quite quick to sign up when under pressure at international, intergovernmental forums, and then slow to translate into national frameworks. And even when those frameworks are one, such as in Kenya and to a degree in South Africa, that these are very seldom translated into operable laws and into practice, despite the ongoing struggles. So, it strikes me that we are talking about continued struggles that we've seen for many years, which is on the one hand, the biases within customary practices, often interpreted in very narrow ways, such as we've seen from colonialism in South Africa through the apartheid process, very patriarchal interpretations of custom that have found ground, but also that a lot of the processes of privatization and formalization of land have reinforced gendered divides. So we have on that one, in that sense, that struggle around legal pluralism means having to confront the limitations of state-driven processes, but also market-driven processes, and of course, customary practices. Bina Agarwal, the Indian feminist economist, has pointed out the ways in which women struggle around land rights, both in relation to state and market and family. Now, if one is to confront those, it requires going far further than just changing laws. Bernard, if we can turn to you. Oxfam has been leading this process for 3 years and obviously has a long history even prior advocating for women's land rights. And your role as Oxfam has been very much one of advocacy in the international arena, engaging with international intergovernmental processes, African Union, regional economic commissions. Perhaps you can explain, what is it that you're trying to get them to agree to, and what strategies have you pursued?
Thank you, Ruth. Allow me begin by mapping out what Sule has presented. And from there, you realize there is really a gap between what laws and regulations speak and what implementation is. So what we wanted is to pick from there and see what advocacy strategies we can use to engage further from an evidence-based advocacy. And we did map out some of the spaces that the project could engage with the duty bearers and policymakers. And one of these spaces was the regional economic blocks. And we engaged with East Africa Community, and we also engaged with ECOWAS. And one of the very things that we got from ECOWAS is that they established a committee on gender responsive and agriculture budgeting for its member states, and also called on smallholder rural farmers to participate in what they could call agricultural budgeting summits in Abuja, Nigeria. Realizably, once this is done and once you have the participation of smallholder women farmers and rural women in terms of land, you realize the conversation changes to much more gender responsive framing of issues. Another aspect that we did engage is the Gender is My Agenda campaign, which is bringing together, which is an organization that brings together women from Africa who are agitating and pressurizing governments and policymakers to act and implement various AU continental protocols and country laws and regulations into realization, to fruition, and bear the fruits and to women. And we have engaged in the 33rd, the 34th, and the 35th Gender is My Agenda campaign at the sidelines of AU Summit. And what is coming out is that we enable the participation of rural women and grassroots women to participate and voice out why it is important for Africa and its governments to successfully realize land tenure rights to women. The voices have been reached to the highest level, to the heads of state at the AU summits. And with this, we also have parallel citizens conference before the heads of summit, before the summit, AU summits every year, and trying to mirror what citizens want as opposed to what heads of state conference is like, and coming up with parallel reports that are also given to the heads of state. The project has also engaged the African Land Policy Center through the biannual conference on land, and trying to learn from the best practices from Africa and bringing this evidence to the fore that as much as we are working on this, there needs to be a community of practice that continuously work on these issues of land. Another space that the project has engaged in is the empowering women in agriculture. which is a movement that's bringing together women and starting to talk about issues of land, mechanization of land, because women are the ones who work on land, as opposed to having only users' rights. They want ownership rights. And at the highest level, we have created social movements and champions in terms of advocacy who are agitating from the very grassroots level to the regional level and the continental level. How then do we start realizing women land rights? If you look at all these efforts that we continuously engage, some of the things continue to come out. That whereas we are having this advocacy at the highest level, at the continental level and the country level, much needs to be done. We haven't realized as much as we wanted 3 years ago and where we wanted to move. Remember, this idea of advocacy was born out of the Kilimanjaro initiative that you have already talked about in 2016, when women climbed Mount Kilimanjaro to the pinnacle as a way of saying we can reach there to the mountaintop and actually realize women land rights in Africa. This is a social movement that we have continued to work with. The grassroots rural women speaking to these issues and having the chart of demands in terms of land rights as envisioned by the Kilimanjaro initiative. And we are here yet to achieve. So I think it's a work in progress. We are still working on it. But in terms what will constitute the factors for success so far in terms of advocacy is we want increased, we have seen increased commitment from land right actors in Africa. As opposed to 3 years ago, when we could not have land rights actors, we are now having increased land rights actors. We have also seen increased commitment and partnerships, from international organizations, local organizations, and rural organizations coming together to work together. And we have also seen partnerships and involvement from policymakers and governments trying to tell us, in terms of political commitment, what actually do you want for us to work? And what we have seen is working best is when we work in alliances, is when we work in networks and partnerships, and you have a movement that is really building towards a particular cause. We will see later how and then this has gone into the global initiatives such as Beijing +25 platform of action, where you are led by Femnet, which is an organization of women bringing together over 75,000 organizations in Africa, and trying to come up with a mainstreaming issues of land rights for the first time in this document of the Beijing +25, and also the generation equality as we walk through this journey. And I hope these are the issues we'll be speaking later. But there are challenges, yes. We continue to have challenges of having evidence that is robust and can be scrutinized, such that when you face government officials, when you face heads of state, your evidence is much robust, is rigorous, and it can stand the scrutiny of time. In terms of training of advocacy issues, these are questions that we continue to grapple with, and also techniques and strategies of networking, lobbying, and advocacy. I would like to stop there at this point and probably engage later, Ruth.
And sorry, I should have said Bernard is a programs manager for land rights at Oxfam's International Pan-Africa Program, working specifically on rights for inclusive development and growth in Africa. So Bernard, I suppose that what you've presented really raises a fundamental question, which is, what is our theory of change? How does change happen? And how it's a very ambitious process to try and engage in intergovernmental processes while also connecting with grassroots struggles and to ensure that those aren't disconnected. But you've highlighted many of the fundamental blockages. The one is being patriarchal norms in society that actually our political elites are not immune to themselves, as we know. That there's been political backing for international agreements, but then these get stuck at the national level. Institutions are intractable. But also we've seen in many countries there's been pushback. When governments come with initial ideas, there's pushback also from political elites, from traditional authorities, against women having control over land outside of family and kinship systems and outside the powers of family members. We in South Africa have seen a raft of draft laws that actually take us back in terms of viewing women as being essentially minors unable to hold and control their own land and to play a significant role in land governance. Let's also remember across the African continent, you mentioned titling. Titling of land is a controversial model, and still around 90% of land in Africa is held under forms of informal or customary tenure. So custom really matters, and a lot of this actually is about contestation of a custom. So I think that it's very exciting that in this project you drew together, on the one hand, the international advocacy and the research with very local level support for women, particularly rural women who are struggling around land. So I'm very happy to introduce Josephine Atangana, who is a program officer with the platform of Central African Farmers Organizations known as PROPAC. PROPAC is a regional organization covering 10 countries, largely in Central Africa, and importantly spans the Anglophone, Francophone worlds. She's had a lot of experience in gender and development as a facilitator and an activist, working around women's land rights, food sovereignty, agroecology. And Josephine, if we can turn to you, PROPAC played a key role in this project, which is to develop training processes and manuals to support women at grassroots level who are struggling around land rights, and to popularize rights-based discourses and to support people who are calling for the realization of land rights, whether it be inheritance, allocation, governance and land administration, that women should be involved in decision making, but also that there is a need for reform of laws and institutions. Perhaps you can take us through a story of what you've done. PROPAC has worked with civil society partners in these 7 countries. What have you tried to do at within these 7 countries? What has been your methods? And in your view, what have been the results?
Thank you, Ruth, for giving me the floor. It's a very good opportunity for us to share what we have been doing in different countries and how we have been engaging civil society. Our first commitment was to put together civil society organizations that are working on women's land right issue, because we have lots of organizations working on the issue of land, but sometimes you don't have societies organization working focus on women's land because sometimes it's a taboo in some countries, and in some localities you don't even have these opportunities to talk about women's land right as a focus. And we had for this process to mobilize civil society organization, put them together and share with these civil societies the results of research that has been made by PLUS. And it was so amazing that to see even in civil society, some do not have these special facts on women. And rural women, there are 53% who are in the population working in rural area. But as you know, also for some of you, that African Union, they have this objective of attending 30% of women owning and controlling the land. So we share this objective with civil society, and we had this experience with lots of organizations that decided to focus to have this focus on women, and with the information they have to make this this struggle more visible and more lighted. And we have trained lots of them on women's land evidence tools that they could now be able to share with local leaders. But to do that, we have also at the level of women the opportunity to strengthen them as on transformative leadership qualities, because sometimes women are not confident, so we need to give them tools and open their mind on the view that they have the opportunities as human beings to defend and to claim about their own rights as human beings. This was a step in the processes we had. So to help women to better understand what is their role as human beings in their communities. At this level, lots of women, sometimes you have a woman telling you that I did not say that I can stand up and in a community. I did not know I can talk to people and be understood and take the floor and discuss with men as partners. That was some results that we had concerning transformative leadership, and to make them conscious about their responsibilities in the communities for themselves, for their family, and also for their communities. When after this step, we had the training of the training at the local level for the tools on the evidence and concerning large-scale land-based investment. In different countries, you have a different situation. For example, in South Africa, you have this issue of mining extraction. In countries like Cameroon, you have issues of agriculture. And when talking with communities, you see that women sometimes they did not, and even the community, the large communities, they do not know how to engage themselves and how to make their concerns, their interests to be taken in account. They need to know about land tenure in Africa, land tenure in their own country. What was the provision made by the laws in the country, and to know how they could engage and how they could be partnering with even government or private sector to make their interests taken in account. We had, for example, in South Africa, we visited some villages that was impacted by mining extraction. And we have this woman, for example, who made very strong advocacy so that the enterprise of extraction give to her and her family the opportunity to have a home, to equip the home, to have a plot to farm, to have scholarship for her children for 20 years. That was a very amazing experience that we share with others women to let them know that they are capable and they could. Sometimes this is a social responsibility for enterprises that some enterprises they know, but when communities do not claim, they could not benefit from it. So we share those examples with communities and let them know that they are able to come and engage in some large-scale based investment when they could not do anything or to stop, if there's no need to stop, but if there's possibility to negotiate, to know how they could benefit more within the processes. So we have also this part with advocacy and communication, where we develop, for example, using scorecards within the process of advocacy was very, very amazing, because you could see even authorities very shocked about the position they have in Africa concerning the implementation laws, of measures, and to say, no, we are not on this level, we are not so bad, we have to do something. And some in countries like Cameroon, they engage in platforms to strengthen themselves, like a local authority. They said we need to come together with civil society and to build our capacity to know more about laws, to know how we can also contribute to defend women's rights sometimes against our brothers, against notables who sometimes they do not know how to discuss and how to prove that we need to share our rights with women, and that is important. Something that also came was the importance of empowerment of women economically, because to be in decision making, women needs also to take their place in the decision making spaces, and it was also very important, and we need to continue that process in that way, empowering women economically so that they could support their struggle. Thank you.
Thanks, Josephine. Thank you so much. And it's exciting to see in the comments several people who've been involved with this process in the past 3 years, but also from the Kilimanjaro initiative in 2016. Pauline Atieno says, I work with ActionAid Kenya. I was part of the team that worked with countries to organize the Women to Kilimanjaro. And my main role was to mobilize women from the grassroots level. And I suppose the challenge is, how does that get sustained? And not just within specific countries, but across other countries. I don't know if we can flash some of these comments and questions up. Also, I see that the Alliance for Rural Democracy has also said we were lucky to be trained on the tool by Nkuzi Development Association. That's one of the land rights NGOs in South Africa. It's very user-friendly. It gives women a voice. I suppose that's in a sense, the innovative part of this process is that it's women themselves scoring their governments and scoring their traditional authorities, scoring the communities. So I think that lots of people would be interested. Perhaps we can move on to a few questions. The first was from Naledi Mpanza. Bernard, you mentioned an organization containing 7,500 women. Can you just clarify which organization, what did it do?
Thank you. I think just to point out, it's 75 organizations and not 7,500. And this is organizations that came together last year, October, in Addis Ababa under the Beijing Platform of Action. And the organization that was spearheading this as a consortium was African Women Development and Communication Network, FEMNET. And for the first time in that meeting, we were able to have a section on women land rights, and this was led by Oxfam and Groots Kenya and ILC. And this has never happened before. Issues of women land rights have never been mainstream in this community, and happy that one of the participants in this, Esther Muiru, is also part of this, and she was very, part of the people who are trying to push this agenda of mainstreaming women land rights into global international advocacy processes. And I think towards the end we'll be talking on what does this mean moving forward, and what are the platforms we should continue engaging in.
Thanks, Bernard. A question for Sule. Constance Mochale says, interesting, I would love to know more about the ownership rights that are more inclusive for our rural tenure. There's another quite challenging question, I think, that comes up after that, which is also asking about, and let me find it now, which is essentially about individual versus communal. And of course, it's from Papa Mesa Dieng. Perhaps Sule, you'd like to start, and then I want to hear Josephine's view. Do you promote individual or collective women's rights on land? And of course, this is a dilemma. One solution that governments have sometimes taken is joint registration of property in the names of both spouses. But that raises its own problems. Firstly, tying married women into a marital property system and not giving them independent property rights. And secondly, raising questions around the rights of single women, single, unmarried, never married, widowed, and so on. So we need to differentiate. Perhaps, Sule, can we give you first crack at this? And then Josephine, we'd love to hear Propak's view.
Thank you, Ruth. Papa, this is an excellent question. This is a topic that academicians and bureaucrats are really grappling with. And the simple answer is individual land titling is not a solution for diverse groups of communities, including women across Africa, because we have pastoral communities in rangelands in East Africa. Individual title is useless because you don't graze in a single plot for over years. Again, individual titling without safeguards, as it is in many African countries, where banks have carried out lobbies to reform land laws that simply allow the land to be taken out without any consent of spouses when land has been used as collateral is useless. And we are behind India and Latin Americans in making sure that if you apply individual titling, then you put safeguards that protect land of the poor. Therefore, if you just offer individual titling, you are ready for land privatization. That's the gate. So therefore, African countries have adopted innovative approaches, like in rangelands, you have collective formalization that protect women's land rights in different ways. So there are issues that really need to be looked at. Again, inclusive ownership of land needs to stem not only from statutory laws, but also from the reforms that are highly needed of our family laws, marriage laws. That's the key, and the customs that really play, and it is the core of the rules of the game in determining land ownership and use of land in many communities in Africa. Thank you, Ruth.
Super. Let's hand over to Josephine. Josephine, big debate, individual or collective. And of course, I think as Shane Peary was mentioning, of course, women don't hold rights in a vacuum. Women are part of collectives, part of families. It's a layered topic. How do you protect women's land rights in a patriarchal society? And is individualization or collective forms of tenure, I suppose they have trade-offs. What is your view as ProPac, and are you seeing some differences in the different communities and countries where you've been working?
Concerning individual and collective women's rights, for us is a case to case, because, for example, we had this discussion 2 weeks ago in when implementing the platforms of multi-stakeholders of women's land rights in Cameroon, in our activities in Widgra. The people said if we give the opportunities to have collective immatriculation, collective certificate, sometimes there are more difficulties in communities within a group of those groups of women. So the two cases are possible. We show communities the two possibilities. Having individual immatriculation is possible regarding the code or familial code or laws on inheritance. So when it's possible for a woman regarding her family to be individually owner of a plot, we help her to understand how she can proceed to do that. And sometimes you have women together who wants to have a farm together also as an association. They could also engage in that processes. It depends on situation. So they have that we give the opportunities. We share opportunities that allow in the laws in each countries. In countries that is, when it's possible, we give them the opportunity to know how to proceed to have individual or collective immatriculation and control the lands they could work on. Yes.
Thanks, Josephine. I suppose many people here are looking at this panel and thinking, okay, we have two men who've played a key role in a project that is about really pushing for and advocating for women's rights. We do have one question about the role of men. And Bernard, perhaps you'd like to answer that. The question, I'm just looking for it, comes from, let's just find it. I can't find it. But perhaps you could just talk about, in your view, both as civil society organizations, but also engaging with male-dominated authorities, traditional authorities, men in government institutions, men in traditional institutions, men in community leadership. What roles do men play as advocates, and how do you engage with other men? What kinds of methods and strategies have you pursued? What have you learned? Just needing to unmute. No. We go for it.
Thank you, Ruth. One of the things that we agree largely, and in African context, is how patriarchal societies have worked in terms of as a bottleneck towards women achieving their rights and become, as human beings who must enjoy their rights as any other person. And one of the things under this is the tool that we developed on training that is called Transformative Women Leadership in Land Rights. It's a module that encompasses both the training of men and women, and men become as champions in trying to tell them, land rights are also human rights, and trying to see to educate them on the benefits that the society accrues when women land rights are achieved and realized. So that is one, and there are quite a number of spaces that we engage. One of them is through the use of religious leaders who are very respected people and start talking in their own spaces to men on why it is important to realize human rights, where land is one of the rights. Another space is the traditional leaders. Bringing them on board, trying to speak to them, and trying to do what we call knowledge, attitude, and practices in terms of changing those knowledge, attitudes, and practices towards a better society, knowing very well that these are socio-culturally ingrained, and trying to call the next generation of champions who are young and not old into these, what I would call the war to realize women land rights in Africa. So it is not a battle of men and women, it's a battle of us working together and understanding there is higher benefits for the society when all of us work together. For what do you gain when half of the team is not in the field?
Yeah, and Bernard, it's striking that the African Union is talking about 30%, a 30% target for women who are the majority of the population. But I think that does go back to Shane's point, which is that it's a limiting paradigm. When we talk about women's rights and women are part of families and collectives, the idea that it's through individualization that people have security actually is a misunderstanding of many social forms of tenure, informal and customary tenure systems. So perhaps we can just get some clarification about what do we mean by individual titling. Sule, let's ask you to answer Jobo Samba's question. When you say individual titling, what do you mean? And perhaps you can add to that by explaining what are the alternatives to individual titling? What other kinds of tenure are there that are more supportive of women, and how do we build towards that?
This is a really debatable question, and I can give an example very quickly so that people can understand. I have a colleague who is doing research in Ghana, and where people give individual titles to women, and men will say, yes, you have your field, take care of it. And then that becomes the burden for women to do everything on their own. Because as Shane clearly say, property rights are relational, and they interact between men and women and the family at large. So we have to look at what works. So there are customs that actually works better, and customary laws that works better on how land are inherited between generation and generation without even individual titles. And then we have to understand, even if we run for individual titles, it is very costly with the current technology. So how do you answer these diverse questions of technology and rights and laws? But we also needed to go back that if we are implementing individual title, which in a simple definition are rights given in the piece of paper. So Africans are actually told to get ownership of land simply by being given peace, because we all understand that Africans own their land by virtue of using and by virtue of inheriting their land from their grandmothers and grandparents. So this is a clear point. So you are told you own your land simply because you have got a piece of paper that was introduced largely by the colonial administrators who colonized African countries.
Thanks, Sule. Can I pick up on that colonial issue? Because in a sense, what we're living with is still a colonial legacy in many of our countries where we have, and this is the legal pluralism story, on the one hand, statutory and privatized, surveyed, titled land. So a range of formalized forms of land rights that often attract certain kinds of state support institutions. There are mechanisms that may be suboptimal, but there are systems that make those rights visible and controllable in a certain way. And the question is really whether that privatization and commodification works for women. And I think that what we see is no, but that also the vast majority of land that falls outside of those systems similarly limit women's access. One of the big issues I think that you and others have raised in the context of large corporate land grabbing is that a lot of the land that is being acquired from communities is in fact not privately titled. They're not exclusive rights, but these are shared forms of common property on which women particularly depend. Josephine, can we come back to you? We do have several questions that relate to the colonial legacy. And you've talked about work that you've done in Francophone and Anglophone Africa. Perhaps you can talk about what do you see as the main differences across the countries? Is it mostly that there's a difference between countries that have inherited sort of a British colonial-based legal code versus a French one, or Lusophone, Portuguese? Are there religious, are there cultural kinship differences? And are matrilineal societies much different from the patrilineal?
I think I will not talk a lot about colonial inheritance, because maybe it will go concerning how the struggle is visible. But what is mainly important here concerns the empowerment of women, women's power in their societies. That is what make every women around all those different social environment, politics environment the same, because women need to have more power, they need to be more strengthened in decision-making spaces, and they need also to be economically more empowered. So even if you are in a Francophone, Anglophone, or matrilineal or patriarchy system, the main factor is the economic autonomy of women and the possibility and the capacity to defend and to talk in spaces where decisions are making. So that's, I think, for me, when you are talking with rural women, even if you are in Malawi, Ethiopia, or if you are in Cameroon or Togo, the main point concerns the power of women in the society.
Thank you, Josephine. We only have a few minutes, so let's move to a few last questions. My sense is that quite a few people would like to think about alternatives. So we have Godfrey from Tanzania asking, Sule, what would you say of the emerging collective land titling approach? Of course, many organizations, including civil society organizations, land rights defenders, have argued that if communities can collectively title, they can defend themselves against external land grabbers. Is this an alternative? What advantages or risks does it bring?
Thank you, Ruth, and thank you, Godfrey. This is an amazing, because in Tanzania, currently as we speak, pastoral communities in many rangelands have opted for joint village land formalization because they know they might have water in one village and they have pasture in the other village. So they formalize collectively, and there's large chunks of land where they control access and use of such lands. So these are definitely alternative to individual title, which does not work in pastoral communities in East African rangelands. But again, Professors Ben Kazin and others have also raised that it's not only collective that works, because like in semi-urban areas, what do you do with communities that are owning pieces of land? So we have to really invest on alternative approach, but approaches that are driven by people, not by bureaucrats and top-down approaches that have failed miserably in Africa.
Thanks, Sule. Because of course, the collective titling doesn't resolve issues of gender inequality whatsoever. And in fact, it seems, in a sense, a capitulation to saying commodification or registration is the only way of securing land rights. Perhaps we can hear Josephine, if you would like to respond to Constance Mochale's question, can the transformative tools be used to monitor in-country policies? In other words, should we all perhaps be picking up on these tools and collectively, it's sort of crowdsourcing, should we all collectively use these and find some way of compiling, essentially our scorecards of different governments? How could that be moving forward? Is that something that you as a team have thought of?
Yes, I think transformative tools are very key in that process. We had this opportunity, transformative tools to upgrade women's capacities and to help them to be more efficient in advocacy.
Okay, let's ask, thank you, Josephine. Bernard, I want to challenge Oxfam. You've clearly been very effective in engaging in this intergovernmental world, but there's clearly a limitation to the sort of professional advocacy and lobbying where civil society engages with heads of state or ministries in Addis Ababa or in regional economic communities. Have you seen actual successes emerging from those processes? And how do you think that all of those fighting around women's land rights can move forward together in this process to Beijing plus 25?
Thank you, Ruth. One of the successes might not be so visible, but the fact that you go into these meetings with government officials and policymakers, and they concede and put some of these initiatives into the documents, that is a win in itself, because what that means, they have committed. And when it comes back now to the countries, what then we have been doing is to capacity build the civil society organizations to pressurize and strategize for the commitments that have been made by the leaders and the heads of state. So that, to a bigger extent, is a plus when they concede and start prioritizing that. But also at the same time, we have seen where at the regional or in-country level, where successes have been made. For instance, in Kenya, working with the Federation of Women Lawyers and grassroots for women movements in Kenya, Roots Kenya, we have seen for the first time women are getting position of leadership in county lands management boards, courtesy of these advocacy initiatives that we have. If you go back to Malawi, our evidences and successes indicate women have got around 15 to 20 women got title deeds on their own through pressurizing. You go back in Kunzi in South Africa, there are successes in terms of engaging traditional leaders through, media campaigns and radio talk shows. And it's after that, and I know there's a bigger conversation in South Africa, but we know the leadership there is committed to have a roundtable summit with the traditional leaders and CSOs towards ensuring seeing how, although it's problematic, how do we come out and start addressing the issues of land? In Cameroon, for instance, we had government officials for the first time sitting down with our proper colleagues whom they are working with the Association of Farmers and do joint visioning towards issues of land and working together. So to us, these are the successes, intermediate results that you can already see. And in terms of long term, I don't know whether I will stop there, but in terms of Beijing Process Plus 25, internally as Oxfam, we have constituted ourselves and we are coming up with position paper and position statement because of our convening power to take it back there to government and say this is what we want. I also know International Land Coalition has these organization members that are working on Beijing Plus 25 platform of action on issues on, yes.
Okay, thank you. Let's hear from Josephine before we close, though. For you as PROPAC, what are the next steps, and what do you think that other civil society organizations, women's movements can be doing as we collectively prepare for Beijing, but also try to build these learnings across countries? Sadly, I think we've lost, Josephine, did you hear me? Okay, last question then. Emmanuel, Sule, if you can talk us through then, this work has happened over 3 years. The research has been done, the activities have been done. We know that often processes like this can sort of come to an end, and then what happens? What happens next? So perhaps you can say, beyond this webinar today, what are the next steps to take these findings and this discussion and broaden it out, and how can people get involved? 1 minute.
Thank you, Ruth. I must say that this is not an end. This is a continuation of initiative that we started way back in 2013 at the Constitution held in South Africa and Kilimanjaro, Tanzania. And today we're here. We believe women have tools that they will keep the movement going. Despite COVID, women are mobilizing through social media to defend their rights. Again, this research is ongoing. We are organizing several webinars until end of November this year. So watch this space for more coming in webinars. We will be engaging government officials and African Union officials so that they respond to our findings, and also they will respond to some of our planned closed-door meetings where we also engage on these political issues around women's land rights. Thank you. So keep watching the space.
Thank you, Sule. And on that note, just to say then, within the next 2 months, we will have a follow-up to today's webinar where we will be inviting key people from across governments and other key bodies as respondents after we've had several engagements with them. So with that, I'd like to thank very much all our viewers for fantastic comments and questions. We're sorry we didn't get through to all of them. We'll keep them and keep engaging with you. I would like to thank very much our speakers, Josephine Atangana, based in Cameroon with PROPAC, Bernard Mosetti with Oxfam in Kenya, and Emmanuel Sule with PLAS in Tanzania. Thank you very much, everyone, and see you very soon.
Thank you, colleagues.